When the arrogant throw loose change at your worth to insult your worth, they never realize something crucial. Sometimes that very change is the exact key to an empire that will completely crush them. The air inside the Harlan County courtroom was heavy, sterile, and chilled to a sharp 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Dust motes danced lazily in the pale shafts of afternoon sunlight cutting through the high, arched windows. Beatrice Alden sat perfectly still. She was 68 years old. Her spine remained entirely straight against the unforgiving wooden bench. She did not fidget, she did not weep, and she did not look away from the polished mahogany table separating her past from her absolute ruin. For 43 years, she had been the unseen foundation of a towering monument. She had scrubbed mud from construction boots, carried thousands of pounds of cement mix in the back of a beat-up pickup truck, raised their children through brutal winters, and anchored the turbulent early days of a struggling, ambitious husband. She had driven hundreds of miles across empty country roads to deliver signed permits, poured countless cups of bitter black coffee for weary contractors, and smiled through decades of quiet, bone-deep exhaustion. She gave everything. And now a wooden gavel was about to erase her entirely. Across the aisle sat Richard Sterling. He was 72 years old. He radiated the cold, practiced polish of a man who owned skylines and commanded armies of executives. His bespoke charcoal suit fit perfectly, devoid of a single crease, creating a stark, painful contrast to the slightly frayed hem of Beatrice's simple, homemade navy dress. Beside him sat Cecilia. She was 31 years old. She was draped in expensive imported silk, smelling of heavy floral perfume and unearned victory. Over the last 10 years, Richard had systematically and ruthlessly dismantled their shared life. With the help of high-priced corporate lawyers, he had shifted every commercial property, every liquid bank account, and every prime acre of real estate into untraceable corporate shell companies. He had legally, meticulously bled their marriage dry. He left absolutely nothing. The opposing lawyer, a tall man with a sharp nose and a predatory grin, cleared his throat. He shuffled a stack of pristine white documents, looked at Beatrice with thinly veiled pity, and stated the final terms of the divorce settlement. It was a calculated mockery. It was not a minor percentage of the vast real estate empire, nor a modest monthly alimony, nor even the deed to the humble, drafty starter home they had purchased 43 years ago. It was exactly $2. Richard reached into his tailored breast pocket. He did not pull out a leather checkbook. Instead, his manicured fingers extracted a single heavily creased piece of paper currency. He placed it onto the polished wood and slowly slid it across the table. It was an old $2 bill. The edges were worn completely soft, the green ink slightly faded, carrying the invisible, crushing weight of 44 years of silent humiliation. 44 years ago, on the sweltering afternoon of their engagement, Beatrice's father, a dirt-poor but profoundly proud tenant farmer, had given Richard this exact bill. It was the only money the old man had to his name, offered as a symbol of a hard-earned blessing for his only daughter. Richard had kept it carefully preserved all these decades. He had not kept it out of sentimentality or respect. He had framed it in his mind as a sick trophy, a grotesque, tangible reminder of the muddy poverty from which he had plucked his obedient wife. Now he was returning it. A low, cruel chuckle rippled from Richard's side of the spacious room. Cecilia let out a breathy, dismissive laugh, her perfectly painted red lips curling into a triumphant smirk. The judge looked down at his desk, clearly uncomfortable, adjusting his heavy reading glasses. Everyone in the room waited for the inevitable breakdown. They waited for the shattered, discarded woman to scream, to tear the legal papers into shreds, to dissolve into a pathetic puddle of hysterical, broken tears. Beatrice did not blink. She looked down at the $2 bill. She looked across the table at the man she had faithfully loved for nearly half a century. The silence in the room stretched out, thick and suffocating. No tears fell from her steady, weathering gray eyes. No tremor shook her worn, calloused hands. She simply reached out, her movements slow, deliberate, and steeped in an unshakable, quiet dignity. Her rough fingers brushed the soft paper of the old bill. She picked it up. "I accept the terms," she stated calmly. Her voice was incredibly steady, acting as a quiet anchor in a room completely drowning in manufactured cruelty. She picked up the cheap black pen provided by the court. With a firm, unbroken stroke, she signed her full name on the final line of the binding divorce decree. She was finally done. Beatrice stood up from the wooden bench. She did not look back at Richard. She did not acknowledge the smirking Cecilia. She smoothly straightened the front of her modest dress, picked up her faded brown leather purse, and turned her back towards the heavy oak doors. Inside that worn purse lay her entire worldly fortune. She had exactly $14 in crumpled bills and loose copper coins. Adding the cruel, insulting severance she had just received from the table, her total net worth now amounted to exactly $16. $16 to start her entire life over at the age of 68. The heavy courtroom doors shut behind her. She stepped out into the blinding Kentucky sunlight, the hot pavement radiating intense heat through the thin rubber soles of her shoes. Her hand slipped deep into her dress pocket, her thumb gently tracing the worn edges of the $2 bill. She had absolutely nothing left to her name, but as she walked away, slowly swallowed by the vast, unforgiving landscape of Harlan County, she did not know the hidden truth. She did not know that the absolute arrogance of her ex-husband had just willingly handed her the precise, undeniable map. A map that would soon unlock a forgotten empire.
The night air in Harlan County dropped to a bitter 45 degrees Fahrenheit. Beatrice slept in the cramped, freezing back seat of a rusted four-door sedan. For 3 agonizing days, her entire existence was reduced to cheap gas station coffee, stale crackers, washing her exhausted face with rough brown paper towels in public restrooms, and staring at the cracked leather ceiling of her temporary prison. She was deeply alone. In the city, Richard was undoubtedly sleeping on high thread count imported silk sheets, entirely oblivious to the immense suffering he had engineered. Beatrice did not cry. She simply wrapped her thin woolen coat tighter around her shivering shoulders. She endured the biting cold in absolute silence. She survived. On the dawn of the 4th day, thick fog rolled across the empty asphalt parking lot. A battered green pickup truck rumbled slowly through the dense mist, its heavy tires crunching over loose gravel and broken grass. The engine sputtered, choked, and finally ground to a halt. The heavy door driver creaked open. Josiah Blackwood stepped out into the damp morning air. He was a 75-year-old rural lawyer, a quiet man with deep wrinkles carved into his face from decades of fighting unwinnable battles for forgotten people. He had been Elias Vance's closest, most trusted friend. Josiah walked toward the frosted window of Beatrice's sedan and tapped lightly on the glass.
"It is time to wake up, Beatrice," Josiah said softly, his gravelly voice thick with sorrow and profound respect. Beatrice pushed the heavy metal door open, her ancient joints screaming in protest from the freezing temperatures. She gracefully accepted the steaming paper cup of black coffee he offered. The intense heat seeped immediately into her frozen, calloused hands. "Did he give it back to you?" Josiah asked quietly, his sharp eyes searching her tired face. "He did," Beatrice replied calmly. She reached into her coat pocket. She pulled out the crumpled $2 bill. Josiah did not look at the fading green ink or the portrait of the former president. He gently took the brittle paper, turned it over, and pointed a weathered, shaking finger at the extreme bottom right corner. Beatrice leaned in closer. There, hidden completely beneath decades of grime and the natural folding of the paper, were faint, barely legible pencil marks. Her father had written them exactly 44 years ago. It was not a random, meaningless scribble. It was a highly specific set of geographical coordinates, followed by a mysterious sequence of 6 distinct numbers. "Elias knew the boy you married was a greedy snake. He knew this terrible day would eventually come." He handed the fragile bill back. "Let us go claim what is rightfully yours," Josiah declared resolutely. They drove 7 miles down winding, pothole-riddled country roads to the old Harlan Commission office. The old municipal building smelled of industrial floor wax, stale cigarette smoke, and deep bureaucratic apathy. Inside the land registry department, a young female clerk with a condescending sneer looked Beatrice up and down. The clerk saw absolutely nothing but a destitute, unwashed elderly woman in a wrinkled navy dress. She haughtily demanded the mandatory administrative fee to pull the archived land records from the dusty basement vaults. It was a steep, painful price for a woman who had just lost an entire empire. It cost exactly $9. Beatrice opened her faded brown leather purse. She slowly extracted her meager $16. She meticulously separated a single $5 bill and 4 heavily creased $1 bills, laying them perfectly flat on the scratched glass counter. The clerk snatched the money with a disdainful scoff, completely unaware of the monumental shift in power taking place right in front of her. Beatrice received the heavy, yellowed paper deed in return. She now had exactly $7 left to her name. She was a landowner once again. Josiah drove her 12 miles out to the absolute, forgotten edge of the county. The old truck stopped at the very end of a ruined, rutted dirt road. Before them stood a massive, rusted iron gate, heavily chained and completely swallowed by thick, poisonous, thorny vines. Beyond the unyielding metal bars lay 40 acres of overgrown weeds, dead oak trees, and a crumbling, terrifying landscape that the entire town had cruelly dismissed as worthless garbage. It was a desolate wasteland. Beatrice stepped out of the truck. She walked purposefully up to the towering iron bars. She placed her rough, dirt-stained hands against the freezing cold metal. With a sharp, powerful exhale, she threw her entire body weight forward, using the dense muscles forged for 40 decades of grueling physical labor. The rusty iron hinges screamed loudly in protest. The heavy gate violently broke free from the tangled earth, swinging inward with a heavy metallic thud. She stepped onto her ruined land. The wind abruptly shifted. A sudden sharp scent rushed rapidly past her weathered face. It was the deep, unmistakable, intoxicating smell of damp earth and hidden life. Standing alone before a weed-choked trail leading into the so-called worthless farm, Beatrice closed her eyes, and her sharp, relentless intuition instantly awakened.
Beatrice walked steadily past the decaying, sagging remnants of the old front porch. The main farmhouse was a rotting, collapsed husk of warped pine boards, shattered glass windows, and rusted iron hinges, completely surrendered to decades of aggressive, creeping vine growth and the merciless, rotting dampness of the heavy Kentucky seasons. She did not stop. She pushed her way forward through waist-high, thickly tangled brush, her heavy work boots snapping dried, dead branches that cracked like brittle, ancient bones in the heavy, oppressive silence of the forgotten 40 acres. She walked past the rusted, hollowed-out remains of a broken tractor, past the collapsed, splintered wooden fences that had once held meager, starving livestock, and past the shallow, completely dried, muddy creek bed. She walked exactly 200 yards deep into the dense, overgrown property, letting her sharp, highly trained eyes pierce right through the deceptive, chaotic veil of total neglect. Then, she finally saw it. Standing completely obscured behind a dense, impenetrable grove of dead elm trees was a massive, looming architectural structure. It was absolutely not a fragile, leaning wooden barn, nor was it a haphazardly constructed, flimsy tool shed typical of the poor, desperate tenant farmers in the deep rural valleys. It was a staggering, towering edifice constructed entirely of ancient, hardened oak timbers. The gray, weather-beaten wood was completely devoid of cheap paint, standing naked, proud, and fiercely defiant against the harsh, unforgiving elements. She approached it slowly. Beatrice stopped exactly 3 feet from the massive front wall, her trained eyes scanning the immense wooden facade with the meticulous, highly calculating precision of a seasoned master builder. For 43 years, she had silently inspected hundreds of luxury commercial foundations, corrected massive high-rise support columns, and drafted sprawling residential frameworks for a husband who could barely read a complex architectural blueprint without her quiet, completely invisible corrections. She knew exactly what cheap, fast, corner-cutting construction looked like. She knew the desperate, fragile structural compromises arrogant men routinely made just to save a few pathetic dollars. This was different. This was an undeniable masterpiece. She knelt down heavily in the damp, freezing earth, digging her bare, ungloved hands deep into the dense, muddy soil directly at the base of the massive exterior wall. Her raw, stinging fingers scraped against something impossibly hard, completely unyielding, and buried deep beneath the soft surface. It was a heavy, perfectly poured, steel-reinforced concrete foundation. The thick, solid concrete barrier extended an astonishing 4 feet straight down into the cold earth, dropping well below the deep, punishing winter frost line to guarantee that the massive building above would never shift, never crack, and never dangerously settle over the passing centuries. It was built forever. She stood up slowly, wiping the wet, dark dirt on her worn navy dress, and deliberately walked the entire perimeter of the immense, silent structure. She carefully inspected the towering structural corners, looking closely at the thick, incredibly heavy oak beams that formed the massive, load-bearing skeleton. There was not a single cheap iron nail, not a single rusted metal screw, and not a flimsy steel bracket holding the enormous, crushing weight of the heavy wooden timbers together. Her breath caught slightly. Every single massive beam was expertly, flawlessly joined using intricate, highly complex mortise and tenon connections, locked permanently and tightly into place with thick, hand-carved wooden pegs that had naturally swollen tight with the changing humidity of the seasons. It was an ancient, incredibly demanding, and mathematically precise architectural technique that required many months of painstaking, absolute physical dedication. High above her head, the soaring, steeply pitched roof was not covered in rotting asphalt shingles or cheap, easily torn tar paper.
It was completely shielded by thick, heavy-duty corrugated steel panels, heavily treated to completely resist corrosive rust and effortlessly repel the brutal, hammering force of pounding rain and heavy, crushing winter snow. He had built a fortress. Richard, in all his arrogant, blind, superficial vanity, had spent decades wearing expensive custom suits and laughing cruelly at Elias Vance, constantly mocking the quiet, reserved old man as absolutely nothing more than a pathetic, ignorant, penniless dirt farmer. Yet the loudly arrogant real estate tycoon had spent 10 years aggressively hiding a fragile, debt-ridden, crumbling financial empire built entirely on cheap materials, fake corporate promises, and predatory, unstable banking loans. Elias had built absolute truth. For 5 grueling, intensely solitary years, her quiet father had stood on this exact remote spot of earth, completely alone, sweating heavily under the burning 90-degree summer sun and freezing silently in the bitter, unforgiving winter winds. He had silently cut the massive oak trees, mixed the heavy concrete bags entirely by hand, and raised these immense, crushing wooden columns without a single word of complaint or a single desperate plea for help. He had poured every single ounce of his failing, aging physical strength into constructing this silent, completely unbreakable sanctuary for his only daughter. She touched the rough wood. The deeply textured, gray surface of the ancient oak timber felt incredibly warm and intensely alive beneath her calloused, blistered palms. A profound, overwhelming sense of absolute, crystal-clear clarity washed completely over her tired, heavily aching body. She was 68 years old, carrying exactly $7 to her name, completely stripped of her past, and standing entirely alone in a ruined, forgotten wasteland. She was finally home. Beatrice stepped back, looking up at the heavy, heavily reinforced wooden doors that tightly guarded the dark, mysterious interior of the towering oak structure. The massive double doors were sealed tightly shut, heavily barricaded by thick, nailed wooden planks and secured by decades of hardened, completely unyielding natural grime. The magnificent, unbreakable skeleton of the building stood incredibly strong and undeniably resolute, but the dark, silent interior remained completely inaccessible. She needed a way inside. To penetrate the hidden, protected core of this impenetrable fortress, Beatrice knew she would have to rely on the only thing her arrogant ex-husband had never been able to completely strip away from her. She would have to immediately employ brutal, exhausting, bone-crushing manual labor to completely shatter the heavy, unforgiving physical seal of time.
Beatrice did not retreat to the rusted, freezing sedan to weep over her lost fortune. She did not fall to her knees in the damp Kentucky mud to curse the cruel, unforgiving universe that had ruthlessly stripped away 43 years of her absolute devotion. Instead, she walked with quiet, heavy purpose toward a collapsed, rotting wooden lean-to attached to the far side of the massive oak structure, her sharp eyes scanning the debris for a weapon of salvation. Beneath a pile of decaying wet leaves and shattered terracotta roof tiles, she found it. It was an ancient iron crowbar. It weighed exactly 15 pounds. The heavy metal was completely coated in a thick, rough layer of dark orange rust, cold and incredibly unforgiving against her bare, aging skin. She gripped the heavy iron shaft with both hands, feeling the familiar, undeniable weight of heavy manual labor immediately ground her racing thoughts. She walked steadily back to the towering double doors of the fortress. The entryway was aggressively barricaded by 7 thick, heavily nailed pine planks, intentionally designed to keep out desperate trespassers, destructive wildlife, and the relentless march of time itself. She approached the massive doors.
She jammed the wedged tip of the crowbar deep into the tight, unyielding crevice between the thickest wooden plank and the solid oak door frame. She planted her worn leather boots firmly into the soft earth, adjusted her grip on the freezing metal, and threw the entire weight of her 68-year-old body directly into the brutal leverage. For a long, agonizing moment, absolutely nothing happened. The thick, rusted nails, pounded into the wood over 4 decades ago, held their ground with stubborn, furious defiance. She pushed harder, her muscles violently burned. She channeled every single silent humiliation, every dismissed architectural correction she had ever handed to Richard, and every lonely, exhausting night she had spent balancing his chaotic accounting books into the heavy iron bar. The ancient wood let out a sudden, deafening shriek. The massive rusted nails violently tore free from the oak, sending a shower of dry, blinding dust directly into the air. The thick pine planks snapped completely in half, crashing loudly onto the rocky ground. 1 down, 6 remained. For the next 3 agonizing hours, under the pale, shifting afternoon sun, Beatrice engaged in a completely silent, absolutely brutal physical war against the fortress doors. She did not stop to drink water. She did not pause to wipe the heavy, stinging drops of salty sweat that rolled continuously into her eyes. The rough, punishing friction of the heavy iron crowbar rapidly tore the thin skin on her palms, raising massive, painful water blisters that eventually popped, leaving raw, bleeding flesh entirely exposed to the dirty air. She ignored the pain. She pried, she pulled, and she violently shattered the heavy wooden barriers one by one, her breathing coming in harsh, ragged gasps that echoed loudly across the completely deserted, overgrown 40 acres. Finally, with one last monumental heave, the 7th and final heavy pine plank surrendered, hitting the damp earth with a heavy final thud. The path was clear. Beatrice dropped the heavy 15-pound iron crowbar. She placed both of her raw, bleeding hands flat against the incredibly heavy, thick oak double doors, pushing forward with the last remaining reserves of her deeply drained physical strength. The heavy metal hinges screamed in furious protest, grinding loudly against decades of accumulated, hardened rust before slowly, heavily giving way. The doors swung open. The interior was completely pitch black. A wave of stale, incredibly dry air rolled out from the dark, cavernous interior, carrying the heavy, ancient scent of perfectly dried oak, thick dust, and total, uninterrupted isolation. As her eyes slowly adjusted to the deep gloom, she saw the massive, sprawling concrete floor. It was completely covered in a thick, suffocating layer of gray dirt, cobwebs, and decades of accumulated powdery sawdust. The sheer scale of the massive mess would have instantly broken the fragile, pampered spirit of Cecilia, who would have loudly demanded an expensive cleaning crew to handle even a fraction of the dirt. Beatrice simply went to work. She found a heavy, wide-bristled push broom leaning quietly in the dark corner. She grabbed the smooth wooden handle with her bleeding hands. She began to sweep. She pushed the heavy, suffocating piles of gray dust and ancient wood shavings across the expansive, 80-foot-long concrete floor, her movements deeply methodical, incredibly rhythmic, and entirely devoid of self-pity. The air inside the massive building quickly filled with thick, choking clouds of gray dust, coating her dark navy dress, completely turning her gray hair white, and settling heavily on her eyelashes. She kept sweeping. She scrubbed the heavy green moss from the interior window frames, using nothing but a dry, stiff wire brush and her own fading, exhausted strength. She cleared away massive, heavy piles of rotting burlap sacks that had been completely shredded by generations of field mice. Her shoulders ached with a deep, piercing agony. Her lower back throbbed relentlessly. Yet the intense, punishing physical labor felt incredibly cleansing, aggressively burning away the heavy, suffocating toxicity of her ruined past and replacing it with the pure, undeniable honesty of hard, solitary work. She was not alone. Standing quietly in the bright, open doorway of the massive oak building was an elderly man. He wore faded blue denim overalls, heavy, mud-cacked steel-toe boots, and a worn, sweat-stained canvas hat. His name was Silas. He was a 70-year-old retired master carpenter who lived exactly 2 miles down the winding dirt road, managing a small, quiet farm of his own. He had heard the loud, echoing cracks of the shattering wood. He had walked quietly across the overgrown property line, fully expecting to confront a desperate group of young, reckless vandals tearing apart the old abandoned structure. Instead, he found her. Silas stood in complete, stunned silence for 10 long moments, deeply observing the 68-year-old woman in the ruined navy dress as she relentlessly pushed the heavy, wide-bristled broom across the vast concrete expanse. He saw the dark, fresh blood staining the wooden handle of the broom. He saw the extreme, agonizing physical toll the massive effort was taking on her aging frame. But above all, he saw the absolute, terrifying resolve burning brightly in her quiet, unwavering eyes. He stepped forward. "You are going to completely tear the flesh right off your hands, ma'am," Silas said quietly, his deep, gravelly voice echoing softly in the large, dusty space. Beatrice stopped sweeping. She turned slowly to face the stranger, her spine completely straight, her chin held incredibly high, and her breathing deliberately controlled. She did not attempt to hide her dirty face. She did not apologize for her absolutely ruined, filthy appearance. "The dirt will not move itself," Beatrice replied calmly. Silas looked deeply into her eyes. He recognized the quiet, unbreakable dignity radiating off her entirely. He had spent his entire life around soft, complaining men who demanded the world hand them everything on a silver platter. He instantly knew that this quiet, stoic woman was forged from a completely different, infinitely stronger kind of steel. "I will be right back," Silas stated firmly. He turned and walked away.
Beatrice did not ask him where he was going. She simply turned her back and resumed her heavy, rhythmic sweeping, pushing the massive piles of dirt closer to the wide open doors. 45 minutes later, the distinct, loud rumbling of a heavy diesel engine broke the quiet afternoon silence. Silas slowly backed a battered red pickup truck right up to the massive wooden doors. He brought salvation. In the heavy steel bed of the truck sat a massive portable diesel generator, weighing easily 200 pounds. Beside it sat a heavy-duty industrial wet-dry vacuum, coils of thick yellow extension cords, a massive red plastic gas can, and a tall, silver-insulated thermos. Silas did not ask for permission. He completely ignored the traditional, polite rural boundaries. He lowered the heavy steel tailgate, grabbed the thick nylon pull cord of the massive generator, and violently yanked it backward. The machine roared to life. The loud mechanical thunder vibrated heavily against the ancient oak walls. Silas quickly unspooled 100 feet of thick yellow extension cord, dragging it deep into the dusty, dark corners of the massive building. He grabbed the heavy silver thermos from the truck bed and walked directly over to Beatrice. He gently, firmly took the bloody wooden broom handle completely out of her raw, stinging hands. "Drink," Silas ordered gently. He handed her the metal thermos. Beatrice unscrewed the cup. It was entirely filled with incredibly hot, rich, homemade chicken soup. The intense, beautiful smell of roasted carrots, heavy celery, and deeply simmered broth hit her entirely empty stomach like a profound physical shock. For the very first time in 4 agonizing days, a tiny, entirely invisible crack appeared in her rigid, stoic armor.
The pure, completely unconditional kindness of this absolute stranger stood in such violent, jarring contrast to the cold, calculated cruelty of the man she had loved for 4 decades. She took a slow sip. The intense heat rushed violently through her shivering, exhausted veins. Silas did not wait for a heavy, emotional display of deep gratitude. He simply plugged a massive, heavy-duty industrial work light into the thick yellow cord. He flipped the heavy black switch. The darkness instantly died. A blinding, violently bright white light instantly flooded the entire 80-foot expanse of the massive oak structure, aggressively chasing away completely every single shadow that had hidden there for the last 40 years. The immense, staggering scale of her father's architectural genius was finally completely revealed in absolute, undeniable clarity. The soaring, perfect wooden joints, the heavily reinforced structural beams, and the perfectly level concrete foundation gleamed proudly under the intense artificial light. "I will clear the corners," Silas offered quietly. "Thank you," Beatrice simply said. They worked together in absolute beautiful silence. For the next 5 hours, the deafening roar of the heavy diesel generator and the loud, aggressive suction of the massive industrial vacuum completely filled the vast space. Silas expertly blasted the heavy, stubborn grime off the high, unreachable windows using a high-pressure chemical sprayer, allowing the fading late-afternoon sunlight to finally pierce through the heavily stained glass. Beatrice focused entirely on the massive, sweeping center of the heavy concrete floor, her movements completely revitalized by the hot soup and the comforting, steady presence of another hard-working human being. The air grew clean. The heavy layer of gray, powdery sawdust that had entirely hidden the true nature of the floor for decades was finally completely swept away. Beatrice pushed the very last heavy pile of dirt straight out the massive front doors. She turned around, holding the heavy broom, to quietly survey the absolute perfection of the fully cleared, entirely massive concrete floor. The blinding white light of the industrial lamp reflected brightly off the smooth, perfectly polished gray surface. Her eyes suddenly stopped moving. She dropped the heavy wooden broom. It hit the concrete floor with a loud, echoing crack. Beatrice walked slowly, deliberately toward the exact, precise dead center of the massive 80-foot room. Her heavily breathing chest completely froze. There, permanently embedded perfectly flush with the heavy concrete floor, was something she had entirely missed under the thick, suffocating layers of dirt and absolute darkness. It was a door. It was a heavy, incredibly thick, perfectly square trapdoor, constructed entirely of heavy-grade, completely unyielding, rust-proofed industrial steel. She dropped heavily to her tired knees. She reached out with her raw, violently trembling fingers. She brushed away the final tiny trace of fine gray dust covering the cold metal surface. Embedded deeply into the heavy steel plate was a thick, complex, incredibly sophisticated, heavy mechanical combination lock.
The heavy mechanical dial felt ice-cold against her raw, violently blistered fingertips. Beatrice did not hesitate. She reached deeply into the frayed pocket of her ruined navy dress, extracting the heavily creased, incredibly soft paper of the old $2 bill. The faint, delicate pencil marks drawn by her father exactly 44 years ago were now clearly visible beneath the harsh, blinding glare of the industrial work light hanging high above. She carefully read the complex sequence of 6 distinct numbers. Her mind instantly shifted from physical exhaustion into a state of absolute, razor-sharp focus. She turned the heavy steel dial to the right. She turned it slowly back to the left. She aligned the final, perfectly precise number, her breath catching entirely in her throat. A sharp, incredibly loud click echoed violently through the massive oak fortress.
the internal steel locking mechanism released. Beatrice wedged her bleeding, dirt-stained fingers tightly underneath the cold, heavy edge of the solid steel plate. She planted her boots firmly on the concrete floor and pulled upward with every single remaining ounce of her deeply depleted physical strength. The heavy metal door groaned loudly, swinging back smoothly on massive, hidden pneumatic hinges that had been perfectly preserved by thick, industrial-grade grease. Beneath the open square lay a steep, heavily reinforced flight of perfectly poured concrete stairs, plunging deep into the absolute blackness of the hidden earth. A sudden, distinct rush of air hit her face. It was not the stale, rotting, aggressively damp smell of a forgotten, crumbling root cellar. It was incredibly dry, perfectly circulated, and mechanically cooled to a constant, precise 65 degrees Fahrenheit. "I will wait right up here," Silas muttered respectfully, his deep voice filled with undeniable awe. "Thank you, Silas," Beatrice replied softly. She grabbed a heavy metal flashlight from his worn tool bag, clicked the heavy switch, and began her slow, deliberate descent. The concrete walls of the hidden stairwell were immensely thick, completely reinforced with heavy steel rebar, and entirely devoid of a single drop of destructive ground moisture. She walked down exactly 24 steps, her heavy leather boots echoing loudly in the completely silent void. At the absolute bottom, she stepped onto a completely pristine, heavily sealed gray epoxy floor. She found the main electrical breaker box on the wall. She threw the heavy switch. Rows of brilliant, low-heat fluorescent lights flickered instantly to life, aggressively illuminating a vast underground space that completely defied all rural logic. Beatrice stood in absolute staggering shock. She was not standing inside a dirty, hastily dug farm bunker, nor was she looking at a desperate stash of meaningless, hoarded junk. She was standing inside a deeply hidden, incredibly sophisticated, state-of-the-art biological seed bank. The underground room spanned exactly 40 feet wide by 60 feet long. Heavy, custom-built stainless steel shelving units lined the pristine walls, perfectly organized and completely immaculate. Resting securely on these heavy shelves were exactly 23 distinct groups of hermetically sealed, thick glass jars. Inside the jars lay thousands upon thousands of tiny, perfectly preserved agricultural seeds, carefully categorized by complex, handwritten scientific labels. But it was the center of the room that commanded her attention. Resting entirely alone on a heavy, solid steel work table was a towering stack of thick, heavily bound leather notebooks. There were dozens of them. They were completely filled with 50 years of incredibly dense, mathematically precise, and vastly complex genetic crossbreeding data. And sitting perfectly centered on top of the uppermost leather notebook was a single sealed white envelope. It had her name on it. Beatrice set the heavy flashlight down on the cold steel table. Her hands violently trembled for the very first time since the devastating courtroom verdict. She carefully broke the dry wax seal, pulling out a single sheet of perfectly preserved, heavy cotton paper. The handwriting was sharp, heavily slanted, and undeniably belonged to the quiet, brilliant man she had loved so deeply. To honor his memory, she began to read the heavy words aloud into the perfectly silent, heavily guarded underground vault. "My dearest Beatrice," she whispered shakily, her voice thick with profound emotion. She took a slow, deep breath to steady herself. "If you are reading this, the arrogant boy you married has finally shown his true, greedy nature," she read aloud firmly, feeling the immense protective power of her father's foresight. I knew exactly what Richard was the moment he sneered at my worn boots 44 years ago. I knew his endless, empty ambition would eventually bleed you completely dry. Tears violently threatened her eyes. She fiercely forced them back. He thought I was nothing but a pathetic, ignorant dirt farmer. Beatrice continued reading, her voice growing incredibly strong and fiercely proud. He never knew I spent every single night of my life secretly mapping the complex genetic architecture of drought-resistant crops. I spent 50 years isolating these 23 specific genetic strains. They will absolutely survive the most brutal, unforgiving droughts this changing earth will ever see. He had built an empire in the dark. But I did not register them under my own name, she read loudly, her heart pounding heavily against her ribs. 1 year before your wedding, I placed every single patent, every single notebook, and every single seed into a completely unbreakable, independent legal trust. The trust is solely in your name, completely shielded from any marital asset division. The absolute brilliance of the trap paralyzed her. And that $2 bill I gave Richard, she read slowly, her eyes widening in absolute terrifying realization. The one he undoubtedly kept to mock my poverty. I drafted a deeply hidden, perfectly legal clause with my lawyer, Josiah. By accepting that specific bill on the day of your engagement, Richard unknowingly signed away every single future right to the Vance estate. He had used the tyrant's own arrogance to destroy him. Beatrice slowly lowered the heavy cotton paper. The profound, overwhelming magnitude of her father's towering intellect and his deep protective love across decades crashed entirely over her. While Richard had spent 10 years aggressively hiding dirty, leveraged money in cheap corporate shells and parading around in expensive tailored suits, her quiet, deeply stoic father had spent half a century building an entirely bulletproof, multi-million-dollar scientific legacy just to protect her from this exact devastating moment in time. She was completely, undeniably safe. She reached out, gently touching the cold, smooth glass of a jar containing the 23 revolutionary drought-resistant seeds. The silence of the underground vault was no longer empty or terrifying. It was heavily pregnant with absolute, undeniable victory. She picked up the incredibly heavy leather notebook. The monumental legacy of Elias Vance was an undeniable, staggering scientific masterpiece. But to weaponize these tiny seeds, Beatrice stared at the cold steel. She reached into her dirty pocket and pulled out the crumpled $2 bill. Her bleeding, raw fingers gently flattened the fragile paper against her heavy thigh. She leaned over the massive mechanical lock, her eyes locked completely on the faint, faded pencil markings her father had written exactly 44 years ago. It was a 6-digit sequence.
She placed her hand on the heavy brass dial. The freezing cold metal bit deeply into her painfully blistered skin. She turned the heavy dial smoothly to the right, stopping precisely on the first number. She spun it back to the left, passing the first number once, and stopped perfectly on the second. She repeated the slow, highly deliberate mechanical dance for all 6 numbers, her breath completely stalled in her chest. She stopped on the final number. A loud, incredibly sharp mechanical click echoed throughout the empty 80-foot room. The heavy internal deadbolts smoothly disengaged. Beatrice wedged her raw, aching fingers firmly under the recessed steel handle and pulled upward with every single remaining ounce of her fading physical strength. The incredibly heavy steel plate, perfectly balanced on hidden industrial hydraulic hinges, hissed softly and rose upward. A blast of air hit her face.
It was absolutely not the damp, foul, rotting smell of a forgotten underground root cellar, nor the stagnant, suffocating odor of an ancient, abandoned dirt tunnel. It was a violent rush of intensely dry, perfectly filtered air, constantly chilled to exactly 34 degrees Fahrenheit. Beatrice stood up slowly. Below her lay a steep, heavily reinforced steel staircase descending deep into the cold earth. She walked down. Silas stood quietly at the top of the stairs, holding the bright industrial work light completely steady, casting a brilliant white beam into the subterranean depths. Beatrice reached the bottom. She stepped off the metal grate and onto a perfectly level, incredibly clean floor covered entirely in thick white anti-static epoxy. She found a heavy electrical switch panel bolted firmly to the thick concrete wall. She flipped the heavy breaker. Row upon row of bright, completely flawless LED lights instantly flickered to life. The underground chamber was absolutely massive, spanning at least 40 feet wide and stretching back another 80 feet into the solid bedrock. It was completely lined with heavy-duty, heavily insulated stainless steel panels. Massive, silent industrial dehumidifiers hummed gently in the far corners, fully powered by a massive deep-cycle solar battery bank, completely hidden behind a secondary protective wall. It was a laboratory. Beatrice walked slowly down the center aisle, her worn leather boots making absolutely no sound on the pristine floor. Lining the steel walls were hundreds of thick, insulated glass cabinets. Inside these heavily climate-controlled vaults sat thousands of perfectly organized, hermetically sealed glass vials. Each tiny vial was meticulously labeled with precise handwritten botanical classifications, highly complex genetic codes, and exact cross-pollination dates. This was not a farm. This was an unbreakable fortress of life. While Richard Sterling had spent the last decade arrogantly sitting in high-rise corner offices, aggressively manipulating cheap paper assets and hiding millions of dollars in highly unstable, fraudulent corporate shell companies, a poor, supposedly ignorant tenant farmer had been quietly rewriting the absolute biological future of the agricultural world. For 50 brutal, completely uncelebrated years, Elias Vance had completely dedicated every waking moment of his solitary life to highly advanced, incredibly sophisticated plant genetics. He had built a masterpiece. Beatrice stopped in front of the master control desk at the very back of the deep vault. Sitting squarely on the spotless steel table was a massive, incredibly heavy leather-bound ledger. Beside it rested a thick, pristine manila envelope, heavily sealed with deep red wax. She reached out and broke the brittle wax seal. She slid the heavy stack of perfectly preserved legal documents onto the cold steel table. The truth completely shattered her reality. The documents were an irrevocable trust. It had been legally established exactly 44 years ago, quietly filed just 3 days before Beatrice had walked down the aisle to marry Richard. The trust completely owned all 23 highly advanced, heavily guarded patents for revolutionary, profoundly drought-resistant crop varieties that her father had successfully engineered. She read the beneficiary name. It belonged entirely to her. The legal language was absolutely ironclad, meticulously drafted by a brilliant legal mind, and buried so deeply in independent corporate structures that no arrogant, greedy husband could ever possibly touch it. Elias Vance had possessed an absolute, terrifying genius that extended far beyond the quiet dirt fields. He had looked deeply into Richard's perfectly manicured, deeply arrogant eyes 44 years ago and instantly recognized the dark, bottomless pit of a completely empty, deeply greedy soul. He knew. Her father had always known that Richard would eventually betray her, that the arrogant tycoon would violently strip away her wealth, her home, and her dignity, leaving her completely destitute on the side of a lonely dirt road. So the quiet old farmer had engineered the ultimate, inescapable trap. He had handed Richard that worn $2 bill not as a humble blessing, but as an absolute binding psychological weapon. It was the perfect snare. Elias knew Richard's massive, suffocating ego would absolutely force the arrogant man to keep the cheap bill as a cruel, mocking trophy. He knew he would eventually use it to deliver the ultimate, crushing insult during the inevitable, brutal divorce. The arrogant real estate king genuinely thought he was brilliantly destroying his wife with a worthless piece of paper. Instead, he had personally handed her the launch codes. Beatrice stood completely still in the freezing 34-degree air. The sheer, overwhelming weight of her father's profound, quiet, unconditional love violently crashed over her. He had protected her entirely from beyond the grave. He had spent his entire life building an unbreakable financial and scientific shield, completely trusting her quiet, stoic resilience to eventually uncover it when she needed it the absolute most. She did not weep. She closed the heavy leather ledger with a solid, echoing thud. Her spine straightened, completely shedding the heavy, suffocating weight of the last 43 years of invisible servitude. She was no longer the discarded, humiliated wife of a fragile corporate tyrant. She was the absolute, uncontested owner of a biological gold mine that would completely change the modern agricultural world. She walked back up the steel stairs. Silas looked at her from the top of the massive open trapdoor, his weathered eyes silently asking 1,000 questions he absolutely refused to voice aloud. Beatrice stepped back onto the main concrete floor. She looked at the crumpled $2 bill still resting gently in her raw, bleeding hand. The massive trap had been perfectly set, the hidden weapon entirely loaded, and the absolute mechanism of profound karma aggressively engaged. She needed a trigger. Her father's hidden legacy was indeed an absolute scientific masterpiece, but in order to completely weaponize these tiny seeds into a massive, unstoppable force that would entirely crush the arrogant empire of the man who had betrayed her, Beatrice urgently required the immediate, heavily documented validation of a highly respected, completely undeniable expert.
Josiah Blackwood made exactly one phone call. 3 days later, a heavy black corporate SUV rolled slowly down the heavily rutted, completely overgrown dirt road. Dr. Evelyn Reed stepped out into the humid 90-degree Fahrenheit afternoon heat. She was a 50-year-old master geneticist from the prestigious State University, a deeply serious woman who had spent 30 years studying microscopic cellular structures. She wore a pristine white lab coat and carried 3 heavy steel cases filled with highly advanced testing equipment. She did not believe the rural rumors. Beatrice silently led the highly skeptical scientist down the steep, heavily reinforced concrete stairs and directly into the freezing 34-degree Fahrenheit underground vault. Evelyn took exactly one look at the meticulously organized glass vials, the massive stack of heavy leather notebooks, and the flawlessly preserved, incredibly complex cross-pollination records. She stopped breathing. For the next 72 hours, Evelyn absolutely refused to leave the heavily insulated underground bunker. She barely slept a single hour. She consumed absolutely nothing but bitter black coffee from Silas's heavy metal thermos and cold, dry rations. Her pale hands violently shook as she meticulously tested seed after seed under her incredibly heavy, high-powered portable microscope. She planted a dozen tiny seeds in shallow dirt trays, strictly measuring their aggressive, impossibly fast root growth, expanding exactly 2 inches in mere hours, with absolutely zero moisture added. She feverishly cross-referenced the highly complex mathematical formulas Elias Vance had written in the dark over 40 years ago. It was a flawless biological masterpiece. On the morning of the 4th day, Evelyn slowly walked up the heavy steel stairs. She looked entirely exhausted, deeply pale, and completely overwhelmed by the sheer, terrifying magnitude of the agricultural miracle she had just officially verified. She sat heavily at the rough wooden table Silas had built on the main concrete floor, completely ignoring the thick gray dust on her expensive shoes. "He solved the Great Famine," Beatrice whispered in absolute, undeniable awe. She looked directly into Beatrice's calm, weathered eyes. "Your father completely bypassed decades of slow, deeply flawed genetic stagnation. These 23 distinct strains will absolutely survive extreme, brutal heat waves and devastating prolonged droughts with absolutely zero crop yield loss," Evelyn stated firmly, her voice heavily trembling with intense professional reverence. "The massive global agricultural conglomerates have spent billions of dollars and decades of research trying to achieve this exact, unbreakable structural resilience." The frantic phone calls began immediately. Josiah handled the highly aggressive, fiercely competitive bidding war entirely from his small, heavily disorganized rural law office. Executives in expensive suits suddenly flew thousands of miles just to stand in the dusty Harlan County courthouse. Within exactly 2 weeks, the massive corporate offers completely solidified. The final, legally binding valuation was officially declared on a heavy stack of pristine legal paper. The core genetic patents and the completely exclusive distribution rights were definitively valued at exactly $11,800,000. Furthermore, the mandatory non-negotiable licensing agreements guaranteed an absolute minimum of $150,000 in direct, pure royalty payments every single year. Beatrice Alden was a multi-millionaire. She had walked out of the hostile courtroom with exactly $16, a ruined navy dress, and a profound, silent humiliation completely forced upon her by a deeply arrogant, fragile man. Now, she held absolute, unquestionable legal control over a massive, completely fortified agricultural empire. She did not immediately rush out to buy expensive imported silk, heavy gold jewelry, or a useless sports car. She simply bought a pair of high-quality, heavy-duty leather work boots. However, absolute secrets of this massive financial magnitude never stay quietly buried. The explosive, staggering news of the $11 million rural miracle rapidly leaked out of the sterile university laboratories and violently infected the ruthless, gossip-heavy circles of the elite commercial real estate world. Richard Sterling heard the massive number. Sitting in his sprawling, heavily mortgaged glass penthouse, completely surrounded by his rapidly collapsing empire, the greedy tycoon felt a violent, entirely sickening wave of pure, dark jealousy. His heavily leveraged bank loans were failing. Cecilia was loudly complaining about her restricted credit cards. He completely ignored the absolute legal finality of his own cruel divorce decree. He smelled the massive pile of fresh, incredibly easy money, and his deeply predatory, highly arrogant instincts immediately took over. He formulated a deeply desperate, completely illegal plan. He violently ordered his aggressive team of highly paid, deeply unethical corporate lawyers to immediately draft a completely fraudulent, deeply malicious legal injunction.
He fully intended to aggressively seize the entire 40-acre farm by falsely claiming his ex-wife had deliberately, maliciously hidden marital assets during the heavily contested divorce proceedings. He wanted every single dollar. Richard aggressively grabbed his heavy imported silk tie, violently stormed out of his pristine glass office, and immediately ordered his private driver to head straight towards the forgotten, deeply rutted dirt roads of Harlan County, completely unaware that his towering, blind arrogance was speeding him directly into a brutal, completely inescapable, and entirely devastating legal slaughterhouse.
The dust had not entirely settled on the rutted dirt road when the massive, heavily tinted black SUV violently slammed to a halt just outside the heavy iron gates. The temperature in Harlan County had climbed to a suffocating 95 degrees Fahrenheit, baking the muddy earth into hard, cracked clay. Richard Sterling stepped out. He was 72 years old. He was sweating profusely, the expensive charcoal wool of his tailored suit heavily suffocating him in the brutal rural heat. He aggressively marched onto the 40-acre property, closely followed by 3 highly paid, deeply aggressive corporate lawyers carrying heavy leather briefcases. They violently pushed their way through the tall, dried weeds, completely ignoring the profound, quiet sanctity of the massive oak structure looming silently in the background. They found her on the porch. Beatrice sat quietly on a newly repaired wooden chair, gently resting her calloused hands in her lap. She wore a clean but incredibly simple cotton dress, her heavy work boots resting flat on the wooden floorboards. She was calmly sipping hot black tea from a chipped ceramic mug. She did not stand up. She did not offer them a seat. "You hid it," Richard sneered furiously. His face was deeply flushed, his eyes violently darting around the massive, completely cleared property, frantically searching for the $11,800,000 he fully believed belonged entirely to him. "You lied during a federal divorce proceeding, Beatrice," Richard yelled loudly, pointing a manicured, trembling finger directly at her calm face. "This massive facility, those highly lucrative biological patents, the massive royalty contracts paying out $150,000 every single year, it is all legally marital property. My lawyers are filing a massive, highly aggressive injunction this exact afternoon to completely freeze every single bank account you possess." He smiled a cruel, deeply predatory smile. "You are going to give me everything," he declared arrogantly. Beatrice took a very slow, deliberate sip of her tea. The hot liquid felt incredibly calming against her throat. She looked at the 72-year-old man she had served faithfully for 43 long, agonizing years. She saw absolutely no towering business titan, no brilliant real estate visionary, and no intimidating, powerful husband. She saw only a desperate, heavily sweating, profoundly weak old man, rapidly drowning in his own colossal greed. She remained completely silent. The heavy wooden screen door behind Beatrice creaked loudly open. Josiah Blackwood stepped out onto the porch. The 75-year-old rural lawyer wore a faded brown suit, moving with absolute, unhurried precision. He carried a single, pristine manila folder perfectly tucked under his left arm. He looked down at the aggressive, highly paid city lawyers with a deep, profound expression of absolute, unyielding pity. "You are absolutely trespassing on private property, Richard," Josiah stated firmly. "I have absolute legal rights to this estate," Richard barked loudly, his neck violently turning a deep crimson shade. "We were legally married for 43 years. She completely concealed massive financial assets to aggressively rob me." Josiah slowly opened the thin manila folder. He pulled out the heavy, completely yellowed pages of the irrevocable trust.
He held them up into the bright, blinding sunlight, fully allowing the aggressive corporate lawyers to clearly see the deeply entrenched, perfectly bulletproof legal structure that Elias Vance had meticulously constructed entirely in the dark. This legal trust was established exactly 44 years ago. It was fully funded and permanently sealed exactly 3 days before you ever married her. It was intentionally completely isolated from your union. You absolutely never owned a single inch of this wood, a single ounce of this concrete, or a single microscopic genetic strand of those seeds. Richard violently scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. Any good judge will easily pierce that ancient paper shield, he threatened loudly. I will completely drain her dry in endless litigation. Josiah smiled a very small, deeply icy smile. There will be absolutely no litigation, Josiah replied softly. Josiah reached into the very back of the folder. He pulled out the heavily protected, thick plastic sleeve. Resting securely inside the clear plastic was the incredibly faded, deeply creased $2 bill, the very same bill Richard had arrogantly slid across the heavy mahogany courtroom table exactly 3 weeks ago to completely humiliate his wife. Do you recognize this exact piece of currency, Richard? Josiah asked quietly. Richard stared at the small green bill, his arrogant face twisting in deep, sudden confusion. When Elias handed you that specific bill 44 years ago, he heavily documented the exact serial number in the primary trust ledger. He included an incredibly specific, absolute ironclad poison pill. If you, Richard Sterling, ever legally surrendered, abandoned, or weaponized this specific currency back to Beatrice to finalize the legal termination of the marriage, Josiah paused, letting the heavy, suffocating silence crush the air. You legally, completely, and irrevocably forfeited any and all future rights to contest the estate. Richard stopped breathing. The 3 expensive corporate lawyers immediately lunged forward, violently snatching the heavy legal documents from Josiah's hands. They desperately scanned the thick paragraphs, their eyes frantically searching the incredibly dense, perfectly drafted legal jargon for a tiny loophole, a single misplaced comma, or a desperate technicality. 5 agonizing minutes passed in absolute, complete silence. The lead lawyer slowly lowered the papers. He looked directly at Richard. "It is completely bulletproof," the lawyer whispered fearfully. "You handed her the legal key to completely lock you out," Josiah stated firmly. "For exactly $2, you successfully purchased your absolute ruin." The crushing hammer of absolute inescapable karma finally dropped. It did not happen with a loud explosion. It happened with a swift, profoundly devastating wave of total financial annihilation. The deeply humiliating story of the arrogant real estate king who had intentionally used a $2 bill to insult his faithful wife, only to accidentally lock himself out of an $11 million agricultural fortune, violently exploded across the entire elite corporate world. It became the absolute ultimate cautionary tale of blind, staggering arrogance. The business world is incredibly cruel to absolute fools. Within exactly 48 hours of the massive public humiliation, Richard's deeply leveraged financial partners completely pulled their massive investments. They aggressively cited a total loss of absolute professional confidence. The heavy corporate shell companies he had spent 10 years secretly building violently collapsed under the massive weight of high-interest banking loans and completely empty fraudulent assets. He was totally bankrupt. Cecilia, the 31-year-old mistress who had loudly laughed at Beatrice in the courtroom, took exactly one look at the rapidly freezing bank accounts. She packed her expensive imported silk dresses into heavily branded leather luggage and completely vanished into the city, completely abandoning Richard without a single word of farewell. He was absolutely alone. standing heavily in the sweltering heat of the Harlan County dirt, completely stripped of his massive fortune, his young mistress, his towering pride, and his entire life's work, Richard Sterling violently trembled. He looked up at the quiet, dignified 68-year-old woman sitting on the wooden porch. She completely owned the ground he stood on. She owned the massive agricultural empire beneath his expensive leather shoes. She had absolutely won. "Get off my land," Beatrice commanded softly, completely devoid of any burning anger or loud malice. Richard did not scream. He did not violently curse. He simply turned his deeply broken, heavily sweating body around and walked slowly back to the waiting vehicle, completely crushed by the absolute, undeniable weight of his own monstrous ego. The heavy SUV slowly backed down the deeply rutted dirt road, disappearing completely into the thick summer dust. The forgotten farm was completely silent once again. Beatrice slowly finished her hot tea. The massive, deeply toxic shadow that had hung heavily over her life for 43 agonizing years was finally permanently erased. The ruthless enemy had been completely annihilated by his own blind, staggering arrogance, violently restoring absolute, eternal peace to the massive oak fortress. Now she simply needed to stand up, walk inside the soaring wooden sanctuary, and permanently drive a final heavy iron nail into the wall, to permanently display the absolute, undeniable symbol of her quiet, victorious patience.
Beatrice did not purchase a sprawling, incredibly empty mansion on a distant, private coastline. She did not waste a single ounce of her massive, newly acquired $11,800,000 fortune on shallow, meaningless luxuries. She had absolutely no desire to imitate the deeply fragile, painfully superficial life of the man who had violently discarded her. She stayed exactly where she was. She utilized the massive, heavily protected wealth to completely transform the forgotten 40 acres of Harlan County. The towering, completely unyielding oak fortress was meticulously restored and legally christened as the Elias Vance Agricultural Research Institute. She established a massive, heavily funded financial endowment. It quietly, efficiently paid full university tuitions for desperately poor rural students, and it aggressively distributed the revolutionary, heavily patented seeds completely free of charge to thousands of struggling tenant farmers decimated by brutal 100-degree Fahrenheit summer droughts. She gave everything back to the earth. 2 peaceful years slowly passed. The deep, heavily rutted dirt road was now perfectly paved. The decaying, rotting farmhouse had been entirely rebuilt from the ground up, utilizing heavy, solid pine timbers and incredibly thick, deeply insulated glass windows. The air was no longer choked with the heavy, bitter dust of profound neglect. It smelled intensely of blooming honeysuckle, rich, wet soil, and absolute, undeniable victory. Beatrice stood quietly in her newly finished kitchen. She was 70 years old. She wore a simple, beautifully woven linen dress, her completely silver hair neatly tied back from her deeply lined, completely serene face. A gentle, cool evening breeze blew softly through the open window, carrying the sweet, heavy scent of the thriving green fields just beyond the heavy wooden porch. The sun was slowly setting. The sky was violently painted in deep, bruised hues of vivid purple and incredibly bright, piercing gold. Beatrice took a slow, deep breath, feeling the absolute, profound weight of total freedom completely settle into her aging bones. There was absolutely no fear left in her heart. There was no lingering, dark resentment toward Richard, who was now completely erased from the elite commercial world, entirely swallowed by his own massive debts and towering, blinding ego. She turned her gaze to the heavy wooden wall beside the window. Hanging perfectly straight, entirely encased in a thick, custom-carved frame of completely solid, beautifully polished oak, was the incredibly faded, heavily creased piece of paper currency. It was the $2 bill. The delicate, barely visible pencil marks drawn by her brilliant, deeply stoic father were perfectly preserved behind heavy, museum-grade glass. It hung there not as a bitter reminder of deep humiliation, but as an absolute, eternal monument to the incredible, terrifying power of infinite patience. She smiled, a very small, completely peaceful smile. She was finally entirely whole. From the absolute, suffocating depths of profound humiliation, and armed with absolutely nothing but discarded, insulting pocket change, this quiet, deeply stoic woman had definitively proven a profound, unbreakable, universal truth. The loud, blinding arrogance of cruel men might temporarily strip away your fragile, material wealth, but only deep, silent resilience and an absolutely unyielding intellect remain the single, ultimate currency. A currency powerful enough to buy back an entire empire.